Peter Singer, a utilitarian philosopher, argues that abortion is morally permissible. Let's examine his thoughts on the topic. Here is a common conservative argument against abortion, and it is logically valid, meaning that if both the premises are true, the conclusion must also be true. Therefore, to refute the conclusion, we must challenge the premises. Typically, the liberal stance is to deny the second premise. A human fetus is an innocent human being, leading to a debate about when human life begins. At which stage in the development can we find a point of moral significance? Here is a list of potential distinguishing points. Let's begin with the first one. Sperm. Well, this one is obviously out of the question, because if a sperm is a human life, then every man is committing murder when they masturbate. But conception then? Well, obviously this doesn't work either, since it would effectively make all abortions wrong. Viability then? Well, this is the point when the fetus possesses the capacity to live outside the womb. However, this point is arbitrary, since it would make the definition of the beginning of life depend upon the medical technology available for the woman. This would result in that it is morally okay for a woman who is 6 months pregnant to get an abortion in a third world country, let's say, while at the same time it would be wrong for a woman at the same stage here in Sweden. But what about quickening then? This is the point when a mother feels the fetus for the first time. Old Catholic theology claims that this is when the fetus receives the soul. But this is mere superstition really, since the baby certainly is alive before this point. So we can simply discard this point. But what about consciousness then? This actually is a potential basis for a cutoff, but very problematic, since some studies show brain activities as early as the 7th week. So none of these points seem to have moral significance, except for maybe when the fetus gains consciousness, but that would make it hard to both discover an unwanted pregnancy and have the time to perform the abortion. Therefore, the liberal quest for finding a suitable cutoff line in the fetal development is futile. But does this mean that we should make abortion illegal? Well, no. If we go back to the original argument, Singer instead aims to refute the first premise. Wait, what? Is he really saying that it should be okay to kill an innocent human being? In a way, yes. But the main issue here is the term human being. Let me elaborate. Singer, being a utilitarian, claims that life in and of itself does not possess any real moral worth. Only happiness or fulfillment of preferences have intrinsic value. Therefore, killing is permissible as long as it won't reduce happiness, increase suffering, or fail to fulfill preferences. From this, it is in most cases wrong to kill someone who possesses a concept of itself persisting through time. Let me elaborate. When I go to bed, I have a belief that it is I, the same person, the same entity, who will wake up the next day. I am the same thing surviving through time. Since I possess this idea of surviving through time, I have hopes and dreams of tomorrow, which means that I have a preference to stay alive. Therefore, it would be wrong to kill me from a preference utilitarian perspective. But from a classic utilitarian perspective, it's a little bit more complex, since if killing is done instantaneously, suffering or happiness is unchanged really. But if we were to allow killing of persons, then people would be afraid that their lives would be cut short, and therefore reduce happiness. So we still should not allow murder because of indirect reasons. According to the philosopher John Locke, this concept of surviving through time is actually what makes someone into a person. So the original argument should be adjusted just slightly here. It is wrong to kill an innocent person. A human fetus is an innocent person. Therefore, it is wrong to kill a human fetus. Now, the first premise is true, but the second one is obviously false, right? Since a fetus does not possess an idea of itself surviving through time. This effectively destroys the whole argument, and from this we can conclude that abortion is morally permissible from a preference utilitarian standpoint and a classic utilitarian standpoint. But let's not be too hasty, since I believe that Immanuel Kant would heavily disagree here. Central to Immanuel Kant's moral philosophy is the concept of the categorical imperative, which states, "Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law." Kant's system is indeed very complex, but to simplify, it suggests that to determine if an action is right, wrong, or neutral, we must ask ourselves, what would the world look like if everyone acted this way? If this hypothetical world results in either a logical contradiction or is otherwise undesirable, the action is considered wrong or forbidden. But what happens if we elevate the maxim of abortion to a universal law? In other words, what if every woman performed abortions because it's a universal law? If this were to happen, sooner or later, no woman would be born, and thus no one would be left to perform abortions. This scenario reveals a practical contradiction. Therefore, from this perspective of Kantian ethics, abortion, when considered as a universal maxim, is seen as morally wrong. One might argue that not all women would get abortions at all times, but this misses the fundamental point of Kant's system. If morality exists, it has to be universal according to Kant, meaning everyone should be able to perform the same action without causing contradictions or undesirable outcomes. So, if you perform an abortion, you are effectively setting yourself above others, implying it is acceptable for you but not for everyone else. In summary, Kantian ethics challenge us to consider the broader implications of our actions and whether they can be universally applied without contradictions. This perspective raises important questions about the moral permissibility of abortion. If my assessment of these philosophers is correct, there is a significant divide between utilitarianism and Kantianism. But are we sure about that? One more thing can be said from the standpoint of Kantianism. Kant based morality on the capacities for rationality and autonomy. In other words, we only possess moral responsibilities towards beings which possess these traits. And it is clear that the fetus neither possesses autonomy nor rationality, right? While the pregnant woman obviously does. Therefore, a Kantian who emphasizes this point rather than the universalization of actions might find the act of abortion to be permissible. The woman's autonomy is more important than the fetus's, since the fetus does not possess the distinguishing factors to make it into a person. What do you think about these arguments for and against abortion? Please leave a comment down below, and also please respect each other's opinions, as this is a very contentious subject. Kantianism is a very complex subject. So if you want to know more about Kantianism and the basics of it, do check out this video here.